Stop believing what you know about World War II. June 4th, 1944. Atlantic Ocean, 150 miles west of Cape Blanco, Africa. 58 German submariners break the surface of cold waters, hands raised in surrender. Their U-boat crippled and taking on water beneath them. They're floating in enemy waters, surrounded by American warships, expecting to be machine-gunned in the water or dragged aboard for brutal interrogation before execution. They've just become the first enemy naval crew captured on the high seas by the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. That's 132 years of impossible precedent about to be shattered. But what Captain Daniel Gallery decided to do next would shock these hardened German veterans, change naval history forever, and create one of World War II's most extraordinary stories of honor in the midst of total war. By the end of this story, you'll understand why one German officer said this moment restored his faith in humanity, even in the middle of history's most brutal war. This is not the story you think you know. To understand why this moment was so incredible, you need to know what submarine warfare meant in 1944. Here are the numbers that reveal the true horror. German U-boats had sunk 3,500 Allied ships by this point in the war. That's not just steel and cargo. Every ship carried letters from soldiers to their wives, photographs of children they'd never see again, medicine for field hospitals, and food for starving populations in liberated territories. When a U-boat struck, it wasn't just military strategy. It was personal tragedy multiplied across dozens of families with every torpedo. By 1944, submarine warfare had become savage beyond imagination. German U-boats operated under orders to sink anything flying an Allied flag, often without warning. No survivors, no mercy. Allied forces had responded in kind, adopting a policy of destroying U-boats on sight, rarely bothering to rescue survivors. Both sides had abandoned the gentlemanly traditions of naval warfare that had existed for centuries. It was total war beneath the waves. But here's what nobody expected. In this context of mutual brutality, one man was planning something impossible. The man who would change everything was Captain Daniel Gallery, a Chicago-born Irish-American who thought 3 moves ahead and wasn't afraid to break rules when rules made no sense. Gallery had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where your word was your bond, and treating people right mattered more than following bureaucratic procedures to the letter. These weren't just character traits. They were about to become the foundation for one of the war's most audacious operations. By 1943, Gallery commanded Task Group 22.3, hunting U-boats in the Atlantic with his escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts. His ships had already sunk several German submarines using conventional tactics. But Gallery was obsessed with an idea his superiors considered completely insane. He didn't just want to sink U-boats, he wanted to capture one intact, with crew alive and submarine functional. Not since the War of 1812 had the U.S. Navy captured an enemy warship on the high seas. That's 132 years of naval precedent saying it was impossible. His reasoning was sound, even if his superiors couldn't see it. A captured U-boat would provide invaluable intelligence. Code books, encryption devices, technical specifications, operational procedures, information that could save thousands of Allied lives and shorten the war. But the obstacles seemed insurmountable. U-boats were designed to sink quickly when damaged, and German crews had strict orders to scuttle their boats rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Gallery started drilling his men anyway, preparing for an opportunity that might never come. What Gallery couldn't have imagined was that in less than 8 months, he'd be staring at 58 terrified German sailors in the water, and the decision he made in that moment would be talked about for the next 80 years. But what Gallery didn't know was that 3,000 miles away, a German submarine was about to make a fatal mistake that would put his impossible plan to the ultimate test. And the young German commander making that mistake was about to learn something about American honor that would challenge everything he'd been taught about his enemies. Meanwhile, U-505 was having the worst patrol of her career, and the crew believed their boat was cursed for good reason. Her previous commander, Captain Peter Schech, had suffered a complete psychological breakdown during a devastating depth charge attack in October 1943. The assault had lasted hours, with explosions so close they cracked the submarine's hull and knocked men unconscious. In front of his entire crew, watching their captain lose his mind under pressure, Schech had drawn his service pistol and shot himself in the head rather than face the possibility of capture. The traumatic incident had shattered crew morale completely. These weren't just superstitious sailors. They were experienced submariners who had seen their leader choose death over dishonor, and it left them questioning everything. The psychological impact was devastating. Many crew members reported nightmares, and several had requested transfers that were denied due to wartime personnel shortages. New commander Harold Lang faced an impossible situation. At 40, he was one of the oldest U-boat commanders still in active service, but he was inexperienced with U-505 specifically, and inheriting a crew that believed they were doomed. The submarine service was already facing catastrophic losses. By 1944, German U-boat crews faced a 75% casualty rate. 3 out of every 4 men who went to sea in submarines never came home. Lang knew these statistics. His crew knew these statistics. By June 4th, 1944, they'd been at sea for 2 months without sinking a single Allied vessel. In a war where success was measured by tonnage sent to the bottom, this was not just failure, it was humiliation. The crew was physically and mentally exhausted, supplies were running dangerously low, and morale had hit rock bottom. Every day at sea without a kill made them more desperate and more likely to take dangerous risks. What Lang didn't know was that Gallery's task group was systematically hunting them, using new sonar technology and coordinated search patterns that made the old U-boat tactics obsolete. The hunters had become the hunted, and neither side fully understood how the next few hours would change both their lives forever. These weren't just military opponents about to clash. They were professional sailors who had been indoctrinated to see each other as monsters, about to discover their shared humanity in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. On that Sunday morning, Lieutenant William T. Tolan was conducting what should have been a routine anti-submarine patrol in his Grumman TBF Avenger. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, but after hours of seeing nothing but empty ocean, even experienced pilots could lose focus. At exactly 11:09 a.m., something caught his trained eye. A dark shape moving beneath the surface, roughly 500 yards ahead. The distinctive elongated shadow of a large submarine running just below periscope depth. What happened next unfolded in exactly 6 minutes and 12 seconds, but hidden within those 6 minutes was a single 7-second decision by a panicked German sailor that would save everyone's life, though nobody would realize the significance until much later. Here's how those critical minutes played out. Second by second, 11:09 a.m. Tolan banks his aircraft and begins his attack run, diving toward the submarine's position while arming his depth charges. 11:10 a.m. Tolan's depth charge attack catches U-505 completely by surprise. The crew had been running at periscope depth, believing they were undetected. The explosion occurs directly beneath the submarine's engine room, sending a massive shockwave through the pressure hull that damages the diving planes and cripples the electrical system. 11:11 a.m. Commander Lang faces the most critical decision of his naval career. The submarine is taking on water. The batteries are sparking dangerously, and toxic chlorine gas is beginning to fill the compartments. He has 2 choices: attempt an emergency dive with damaged equipment and likely kill his entire crew, or surface immediately and face almost certain destruction by enemy aircraft and warships. 11:12 a.m. Lang makes his decision. Emergency surface. All ballast tanks blown simultaneously. 11:15 a.m. U-505 breaks the surface like a wounded whale. Water cascading from her damaged hull, her diesel engines coughing desperately to life as her crew fights to get fresh air into the boat and clear the poisonous gas from the compartments. But here's what neither the Americans nor Germans knew at this crucial moment. A single mistake by one terrified sailor was about to change everything. Captain Cavalry, monitoring radio traffic from the bridge of the Guadalcanal 12 miles away, received Toland's contact report and knew instantly this was the moment he'd been preparing for. This was his one chance to attempt something that hadn't been accomplished in 132 years. Cavalry had perhaps 90 seconds to make a decision that would either make naval history or result in a catastrophic failure that could cost dozens of American lives. Standard procedure was clear: close range and destroy the submarine with gunfire before it could submerge again or mount any kind of counterattack. Every tactical manual, every bit of training, every precedent from this war demanded immediate destruction. But Cavalry had been drilling his crew for exactly this scenario for months, and he knew that captured German submarine could provide intelligence worth more than a dozen sunk U-boats. Instead of ordering his destroyers to open fire, Cavalry gave the order his crew had been practicing: away all boats. We're going to board her. As American sailors launched their small boats and began racing toward the surfaced submarine, German sailors were pouring out of U-505's conning tower and jumping into the Atlantic. Some were wounded from the depth charge attack. Others were simply terrified, having been told that capture by Americans meant torture and execution. But thick black smoke was pouring from the submarine's damaged hull, clear evidence that she was badly damaged and potentially about to explode from internal fires or scuttling charges. Mong, the German crew, abandoning ship, was Petty Officer Gottfried Fischer, a 19-year-old sailor who had been given the most critical order of his life: set the scuttling charges that would send U-505 to the bottom within minutes, ensuring no valuable intelligence could fall into enemy hands. But in his panic, watching American warships closing in and hearing the roar of aircraft overhead, Fischer made a critical error that would save everyone's life. He set the timer for 7 minutes instead of 30 seconds. This single mistake meant the difference between life and death for every man involved, but the Americans boarding U-505 had no idea they were racing against a 7-minute clock instead of a 30-second one. They believed they had perhaps half a minute before the submarine exploded beneath them, making their boarding attempt a virtual suicide mission. Lieutenant Albert David of the USS Pillsbury, at 23 years old, was about to lead the first hostile boarding of an enemy warship by U.S. forces since the War of 1812. David understood exactly what he was volunteering for: boarding a damaged enemy submarine that could explode at any moment, potentially under fire from remaining crew members, with no way of knowing what booby traps or scuttling devices waited below deck. Despite knowing the odds, David didn't hesitate. But here's what defied every expectation these German sailors had about their American enemies. As the U-boat crew floated in the cold Atlantic waters, many wounded, all terrified, expecting to be machine-gunned where they floated or left to drown, American sailors instead began throwing them life preservers. When the first wounded Germans were hauled aboard the destroyers, they received immediate medical attention from the same Navy corpsmen who treated American casualties. Professional medical care. No interrogation, no brutality. Just sailors helping sailors. Captain Cavalry's orders to his crew were explicit and unprecedented. These prisoners were to be treated as professional military personnel, not as war criminals or enemies to be brutalized. The German sailors, who had been systematically indoctrinated to believe that Americans were barbaric enemies who showed no mercy to prisoners, found themselves receiving dry clothes, hot meals, and immediate medical care for their injuries. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Some of the German crew had minor injuries from the depth charge attack and the chaotic abandoning of their submarine. American medical personnel treated these wounds with exactly the same care and professionalism they would show their own wounded men. Burns were cleaned and bandaged. Cuts were sutured. Men suffering from smoke inhalation received oxygen. More shocking still was the behavior of the American sailors themselves. Instead of the savage enemies portrayed in German propaganda, these Germans encountered professional naval personnel who treated them with military courtesy. They were given clean quarters, regular meals, and were allowed to maintain their military organization and discipline among themselves. But Gallery's real challenge was just beginning. Capturing the submarine and crew was only the first step. What came next would require a level of operational security and strategic thinking that would test every assumption about how to handle enemy prisoners in wartime. Gallery's solution was as audacious as capturing U-505 itself. Working directly with naval intelligence in Washington, he arranged for the German crew to be secretly transported to a specially prepared facility at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, where they would be kept in complete isolation from the outside world. The entire operation required creating false documentation, fabricating cover stories, and ensuring that no word of the capture ever reached German intelligence. The logistical complexity was staggering. The German crew had to be transported in small groups, under heavy guard, with elaborate cover stories prepared for anyone who might encounter them during transport. As far as official records showed, these weren't submarine prisoners at all, but rather German prisoners who had been captured in North Africa and required special handling due to their alleged knowledge of sensitive technology. What the Germans found at Camp Ruston shocked them even more than their treatment aboard the American ships. Instead of the harsh prison conditions they had expected, they were housed in clean, well-maintained barracks that were superior to many facilities housing American soldiers. They were provided with regular meals that were often better in quality and quantity than what American soldiers were eating in combat zones overseas. They had access to recreational activities, educational programs, and were allowed to maintain their military structure and discipline within their own ranks. Gallery's orders regarding the U-505 crew were specific and revolutionary for wartime prisoner handling. The German submariners were to be treated as professional military prisoners, not as criminals or enemies to be punished. They would work for actual wages, receive male privileges under carefully controlled conditions, and maintain military discipline and organization within their own community. This wasn't just humanitarian policy, though it was certainly that. It was strategically essential for multiple reasons. Well-treated prisoners were statistically far less likely to attempt escape, which could have compromised the entire operation and revealed the capture secret to German intelligence. Moreover, intelligence officers quickly discovered that the Germans' genuine gratitude for their treatment made them remarkably cooperative in providing technical information about submarine operations, German naval procedures, and strategic intelligence that proved invaluable. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved in the operation. German submarine crews, who had been portrayed in Allied propaganda as ruthless killers of merchant sailors and civilians, were proving to be professional military personnel who responded to professional treatment with professional behavior. They maintained discipline, followed camp regulations, and many volunteered information that helped save Allied lives. But the real intelligence treasure was the submarine itself and everything captured with it. The numbers tell the story of just how valuable this operation became. The intact Enigma machine and accompanying codebooks provided Allied codebreakers with unprecedented access to German naval communications. Within weeks, cryptographers at Bletchley Park were reading German submarine deployment orders, supply schedules, and operational plans in real time. This intelligence directly contributed to saving hundreds of Allied merchant ships and thousands of sailor lives over the following months. Technical intelligence from U-505 revealed German engineering improvements and tactical innovations that were immediately shared with Allied submarine designers and naval tacticians. Detailed charts and navigation equipment helped convoy planners route shipping away from known German submarine concentration areas. The submarine's periscope technology, torpedo guidance systems, and hull design features all provided insights that enhanced Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological intelligence gathered from extensive debriefing of the crew provided unprecedented insights into German submarine service morale, training procedures, and operational limitations. This information helped Allied forces understand German submarine capabilities and vulnerabilities in ways that had never been possible before. While the U-505 crew settled into their strange new life in Louisiana, completely isolated from the outside world, the intelligence from their submarine was already changing the course of the war in the Atlantic. Allied convoy losses dropped significantly in shipping lanes, where the intelligence was applied. German submarine effectiveness declined as Allied forces used captured information to predict and counter German tactics. But Gallery's most significant contribution to the war effort may have been proving that treating enemy prisoners with dignity and professional respect wasn't just morally superior, it was strategically more effective than traditional harsh treatment. His approach became a carefully studied model for prisoner operations throughout the remainder of the war, though the specific details remained classified for years. Word of Gallery's success spread quietly through military intelligence circles and upper command levels. Other naval and military commanders began adopting similar approaches with captured enemy personnel, consistently achieving positive results. Better intelligence cooperation, significantly fewer escape attempts, reduced security problems, and improved information quality became the documented outcomes of respectful prisoner treatment. Gallery's decision had profound personal impacts that extended far beyond military strategy. American sailors who participated in the capture and subsequent prisoner handling later described it as the most meaningful and morally significant moment of their entire naval service. Not because they had captured an enemy vessel, which was certainly a remarkable achievement, but because they had demonstrated humanity and professional honor in the midst of total war. For the German crew, the experience proved equally transformative on a personal level. These men had been systematically indoctrinated through Nazi propaganda to see Americans as barbaric enemies who showed no mercy to prisoners and treated captured Germans as subhuman. Instead, they discovered that their captors were professional sailors, much like themselves, capable of both military effectiveness and personal honor, men who chose dignity over revenge, even when revenge would have been entirely justified. The psychological impact of this treatment created unexpected bonds between former enemies. Several German crew members later wrote that their time as prisoners fundamentally changed their understanding of their American captors and of war itself. They had experienced firsthand that enemies could maintain professional respect and human decency even in the context of total warfare. The operational security requirements meant that the secret of U-505's capture had to be maintained not just throughout the war, but for several years afterward. The German crew was finally released and repatriated to Germany in 1946, more than 2 years after their capture. During this entire period, they had been completely isolated from any information about the war's progress, the fate of their families, or the ultimate outcome of the conflict. When the former prisoners finally returned to a defeated Germany, they found a country devastated by bombing, divided by occupation, and struggling to rebuild from complete destruction. Many of their fellow U-boat veterans hadn't survived the war. German submarine service statistics were devastating. More than 75% of submarine crews had been killed in action, making it one of the most dangerous military assignments of the entire war. The crew's initial stories of their respectful treatment met with skepticism from other German veterans who had experienced traditional prisoner of war conditions. But as details of their experience emerged and were corroborated by multiple witnesses, The U-505 experience became a powerful example of how enemies could treat each other with honor and professionalism, even in the context of total war. Harold Lang, the young submarine commander who had expected summary execution that June morning, lived until 2003, spending decades speaking publicly about the respect and professional treatment he received from his American captors. Lang frequently said in interviews that Gallery's decision had restored his faith that basic human decency could survive even in the most brutal circumstances of total warfare. Think about this for a moment. These German sailors had floated in enemy waters expecting to die. Instead, they experienced something that fundamentally challenged everything they had been taught about their American enemies. The U-505 crew proved remarkably cooperative during their entire detention at Camp Ruston, providing a powerful testament to how respectful treatment can transform former enemies into cooperative allies rather than bitter adversaries. Years later, in extensive interviews, Harold Lang reflected that the dignified treatment he and his crew received made cooperation feel like the honorable choice rather than betrayal of his country. This wasn't collaboration born of fear or coercion. It was professional respect, reciprocated with professional behavior. And here's something truly remarkable that demonstrates the lasting impact of Gallery's decision. When U-505 was eventually moved to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry in 1954, German U-boat veterans who had immigrated to America after the war volunteered their time and expertise to help preserve and maintain their former enemy. These men, who had once fought desperately against Allied forces, worked alongside American veterans to ensure this extraordinary story of honor in warfare would never be forgotten. The capture of U-505 reminds us that the greatest generation wasn't just great because they won World War II through superior firepower or industrial capacity. They were great because of how they chose to fight it, maintaining their moral principles even when expedience would have been easier and brutality would have been justified. When Captain Daniel Gallery had the opportunity to follow the established brutal precedent of submarine warfare, he chose instead to follow his conscience and his deeply held sense of honor. Gallery could have easily sunk U-505 and left her crew to drown in the Atlantic. He could have captured them and subjected them to harsh imprisonment and brutal interrogation. Military necessity and justified wartime hatred would have supported either choice. Instead, he chose a third path, one that required more courage, more leadership, and more faith in fundamental human decency than simply following standard orders or giving in to hatred ever would have required. Gallery's decision didn't just save 58 German lives or provide valuable military intelligence. It demonstrated that victory achieved through honor and maintaining moral principles is infinitely more meaningful than victory achieved through brutality and abandoning human dignity. It proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, when the entire world seemed consumed by hatred and violence, individuals can still make choices that honor our better angels and preserve hope for a more decent future.